The carriage wheel cracked in half with a sound like a gunshot, and Eleanor Hartley was thrown against the door as the whole cabin dropped sideways into the mud. For a moment she could not breathe. Dust filled the air. Somewhere above her, the driver was shouting for the horses to calm down, and the horses were not listening. Eleanor pushed the door open with her shoulder and climbed out into the cold, her gloves sinking into wet earth, her carefully arranged hair falling loose across her face. She was already late. Now she would be later. Every noble family within 100 miles was racing toward Ashworth Manor that morning, each one carrying a daughter dressed like a jewel, each one hoping that daughter would return home wearing a duke's ring. Eleanor was not supposed to be one of them. She came from a small, quiet family with more debts than land, and she had only been added to the list of brides because her aunt had once done a favor for a steward who owed her a favor in return. Nobody expected her to win anything. Eleanor did not expect it either. She looked at the broken wheel, then at the darkening sky, then at the driver's pale face, and she understood the truth immediately. There would be no fixing this in time. "How long?" she asked. The driver, a thin man named Peter, shook his head. "An hour, my lady. Maybe more. The axle is bent as well as the wheel." Eleanor closed her eyes for a second. An hour would ruin everything. The other carriages were probably already turning up the long drive toward the manor, their occupants powdered and pressed, practicing their smiles. She pictured herself arriving with mud on her hem and her hair undone, and she almost laughed at how little it would matter in the end. She had never truly believed she would be chosen. She had only come because refusing would have embarrassed her family, and because a small, secret part of her was curious to see the famous manor everyone talked about. She told Peter to do what he could, and she began to walk along the road to stretch her legs while she waited, pulling her cloak tight against the wind. That was when she heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the noise of the wind moving through the trees, but it repeated, sharp and small, like someone in pain trying not to be heard. Eleanor stopped walking. She turned her head toward a narrow bend in the road where the trees grew close together, and she saw her. An old woman was on her knees in the mud, one hand pressed against a fallen basket, the other pressed against her own ankle. Apples had rolled everywhere, some already lost into the ditch beside the road. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders. She was trying to gather her things without rising, and every attempt seemed to cause her pain. Eleanor did not think. She simply moved. She lifted her skirts and ran toward the woman, ignoring the mud that splashed up against her stockings, ignoring the fact that two other carriages had already rolled past this same spot without a single one of them stopping. She had seen them from a distance, their curtains drawn tightly against the cold, their drivers focused only on speed. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor asked, kneeling down beside her. The old woman looked up, startled, her eyes pale gray and sharp despite her age. "My ankle," she said. "I twisted it stepping down from the path. Foolish of me to walk this road alone, but I have walked it 1,000 times before." "You are not foolish," Eleanor said gently. "The road is simply cruel today." She began collecting the scattered apples first, tucking them back into the basket one by one, then turned her attention to the woman's ankle. It was already beginning to swell beneath her stocking. Eleanor pressed her fingers carefully around the joint, the way she had once seen a physician do for her younger brother after a fall from a horse. "It is not broken," she said, "but you should not walk on it. Where do you live? Is it far?" The old woman studied her for a long moment before answering, as if she were trying to understand something about Eleanor that had nothing to do with the question at all. "Not far," she said finally. "A small cottage past the bend, near the old well. Then let me help you there. You have somewhere to be, child. I can see it in your dress. You are dressed for something important." Eleanor almost smiled at that. I was dressed for something important. Now I am dressed for helping an old woman home, and that seems far more important to me at this moment. She helped the woman to her feet, letting her lean fully against her shoulder, and together they made their slow way down the road, the basket of apples balanced against Eleanor's hip. The wind picked up as they walked, cold and biting, and Eleanor did not complain once, though her thin traveling cloak was no match for the weather. The cottage, when they reached it, was small and plain, with smoke rising from a narrow chimney, and a garden gone quiet for the winter. Eleanor helped the woman inside, settled her into a chair near the fire, and without being asked, found the kettle and set water to boil. "You do not need to trouble yourself further," the woman said, watching her move around the small kitchen with an ease that seemed to surprise her. It is no trouble, Eleanor said. I would want someone to do the same for my own mother, if she were ever alone on a cold road. She made tea, wrapped a blanket around the woman's shoulders, and knelt again, to check the ankle, wrapping a strip of clean cloth around it to keep the swelling from worsening. The old woman watched her the entire time, with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet wonder. What is your name, child? She asked at last. Eleanor Hartley. And where were you traveling today? Eleanor Hartley, dressed as though you were meant for a grand occasion. Eleanor hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish. There is a gathering at Ashworth Manor. The Duke is choosing a bride. I was invited, though I do not expect anything to come of it. My carriage broke down not far from here, which is how I came to hear you. Something flickered across the old woman's face, quick and unreadable, gone before Eleanor could name it. The Duke's gathering, she repeated softly. Yes, I have heard of it. Everyone has heard of it, I think, Eleanor said, smiling faintly. The whole countryside has spoken of nothing else for weeks. And you do not wish to be chosen? Eleanor considered the question honestly. I do not know the man. I know only what people say of him, and people say many things that are not always true. I came because my family asked it of me, not because I dreamed of becoming a duchess. She paused, then added, though I suppose most of the other young women dreamed of exactly that. The old woman studied her for a long moment, her pale eyes thoughtful. Tell me, Eleanor, if you had continued on your journey without stopping, would you have arrived at the manor in time? Perhaps. It is difficult to say. And yet you stopped anyway. You were hurt, Eleanor said simply, as though the answer required no further explanation. I could not have walked past you and thought of nothing else for the rest of the day. The old woman nodded slowly, and something in her expression softened, though Eleanor could not have said exactly what it meant. They sat together a while longer, sharing tea and quiet conversation, the old woman asking small questions about Eleanor's family, her home, her thoughts on the world, and Eleanor answering honestly, without pretense, because there seemed no reason to pretend with a stranger she would likely never see again. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, the gray sky sliding toward evening. Eleanor knew she needed to return to the road, to check on her carriage, to continue toward the manor, even though she had surely missed the formal arrival by now. But she found herself reluctant to leave the small, warm cottage and the strange, watchful woman who had welcomed her so completely. You should go, the old woman said finally, as though reading her thoughts. Your carriage will be waiting, and the road grows dark quickly this time of year. Will you be all right? Your ankle. I have neighbors who check on me, the woman said, and you have done more for me today than most people would have thought to do. I will not forget it. Eleanor rose, gathering her cloak, and gave the woman's hand a gentle squeeze before stepping toward the door. I hope your ankle heals quickly. And I hope your journey ends exactly as it should, the woman replied, her voice carrying a strange weight that Eleanor did not think much of at the time. Eleanor walked back along the darkening road, her shoes soaked through, her hem heavy with mud, her hair long since fallen from its careful pins. She found Peter still working at the wheel, nearly finished, and she climbed back into the carriage as the sky turned the color of ash. She did not know the name of the woman she had helped. She did not think to ask. She had no way of knowing, as the carriage finally lurched forward and continued its slow journey toward Ashworth Manor, that the woman she had left behind by the fire, wrapped in a borrowed blanket with tea warming her hands, was the mother of the very Duke she was traveling to meet. She had no way of knowing that somewhere ahead, behind the tall iron gates and the long stone drive, dozens of noble daughters were already arranging themselves into perfect rows, rehearsing their curtsies, praying for a chance that Eleanor had never truly wanted in the first place. All she knew, as the carriage rattled forward into the night, was that she had done what felt right, and that whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she would arrive as herself, muddy hem and all, with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying her toward a future she could not yet imagine, one built not on a rehearsed smile or a practiced curtsy, but on a small, quiet act of kindness on a cold and forgotten road. The gates of Ashworth Manor rose out of the darkness like the jaws of some great sleeping animal, and Eleanor's carriage passed beneath them long after every other bride had already arrived. Lanterns lined the long stone drive, throwing pools of orange light across the gravel. Eleanor could see other carriages already empty, their horses being led away to the stables, and through the tall windows of the manor, she could see the golden glow of a hall full of people. Her stomach tightened. She smoothed her skirt uselessly, knowing it would do nothing to hide the dried mud along the hem, and stepped down from the carriage the moment it stopped. A footman met her at the entrance, his face carefully blank in the way of servants trained never to show surprise, though his eyes flicked once, briefly, to the state of her dress. "This way, my lady," he said, and led her through a side corridor, rather than the grand front doors, as though even the house itself understood she was arriving through the back of the evening rather than its front. The sound reached her before the sight did. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, the low hum of dozens of conversations happening at once. When the footman finally opened the door to the great hall, Eleanor stepped into a world so bright and so beautiful that she nearly forgot, for a moment, the state of her own appearance. Chandeliers burned overhead, throwing light across polished floors. Noble women in silk gowns of every color moved through the room like a garden come to life, their hair studded with pearls and jewels, their laughter practiced and light. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised dais, surrounded by advisors and household staff, sat a young man Eleanor did not need to be told was the Duke. He was younger than she had expected, with dark hair swept back from a serious face, and an expression that seemed politely bored, as though he had already heard every clever thing a person could say to him, and was waiting for something new. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anyone in particular. His eyes moved across the room the way a man's eyes move across a room he does not wish to be in. Eleanor felt every gaze turn toward her the moment she stepped further into the light. "Is that mud?" someone whispered, not quietly enough. A ripple of laughter passed through a cluster of young women near the refreshment table, each one dressed as though she had stepped directly from a painting. Eleanor recognized none of them by name, though she recognized the type immediately, the particular kind of confidence that came from having never once doubted your own welcome in a room. She lifted her chin and walked forward anyway. A woman with sharp eyes and golden curls stepped slightly into her path, her smile polite on the surface and cutting underneath. "You must be the young lady whose carriage broke down," she said. "News travels quickly in a house full of servants. I do hope the accident was not too frightening." "It was only a wheel," Eleanor said evenly. "Nothing frightening about it." "Of course," the woman said, her eyes traveling once, deliberately, down Eleanor's mud-streaked hem. Still, what a shame to arrive looking so natural, when everyone else has taken such care. "I am Charlotte Winslow," she added, as though the introduction were a favor being granted, rather than a courtesy exchanged. "My family has known the Duke's family for 3 generations. Eleanor Hartley," Eleanor replied simply, offering nothing more, because she sensed that anything more would only be used against her. Charlotte's smile widened slightly, satisfied, and she turned back toward her circle of friends, already whispering something that made 2 of them glance over their shoulders at Eleanor, with poorly hidden amusement. Eleanor found a quiet corner near one of the tall windows, and stood there for a moment, watching the room. She was not embarrassed, not exactly. She had expected something like this. What surprised her instead was how tired she felt, how little she cared for the glittering spectacle around her, how strange it was to stand in a room full of women, all competing for the attention of a man none of them had truly spoken to yet. A steward moved through the crowd, calling names for the formal introductions, and Eleanor watched as, one by one, the noble daughters approached the dais, curtsied with practiced grace, and exchanged a few polished words with the Duke before stepping aside to make room for the next. When her own name was finally called, the steward's voice carried a note of hesitation, as though he too had noticed the state of her dress and was bracing himself for whatever reaction it might bring. "Lady Eleanor Hartley," he announced. Eleanor walked forward, aware of every eye in the room following her, aware of the whispers that rose and fell like a tide behind her back. She reached the dais and offered a curtsy, simple and unadorned, without the elaborate flourish some of the other women had performed. The Duke looked at her properly for the first time. His eyes moved over the mud on her hem, the loose strands of hair that had escaped their pins, the plain, unremarkable cut of her traveling dress compared to the silks around her. For a moment, Eleanor braced herself for the same polite disdain she had seen in his eyes when addressing the earlier introductions, the same practiced boredom. Instead, something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through the boredom like light through a crack. "Lady Hartley," he said, "I understand your journey here was eventful. A broken wheel, Your Grace. Nothing more dramatic than that. And yet you arrived anyway, rather than turning back." "Turning back seemed a waste of a perfectly good journey," Eleanor said, and immediately wondered if the words had been too bold, too careless for the occasion. But the Duke's mouth curved, just slightly, at one corner. "A practical philosophy," he said. "Rare among the guests I have met this evening." Eleanor did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, only held his gaze for a moment longer than perhaps was proper, before stepping aside, as the steward called the next name. As she moved away from the dais, she caught Charlotte Winslow watching her, with an expression that had lost some of its earlier amusement, replaced now by something colder and more calculating. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and idle conversation, none of which Eleanor found particularly memorable. She spoke briefly with a shy young woman named Beatrice, who seemed as uncomfortable with the spectacle as Eleanor felt, and exchanged polite nothings with an older woman, who turned out to be Beatrice's mother, anxiously overseeing her daughter's every interaction. Eleanor found a seat near the edge of the hall as the formal introductions concluded and refreshments were served, grateful for a moment of stillness after the tension of arrival. It was there, watching the glittering crowd from a slight distance, that she noticed a side door open near the back of the hall, and a woman step through it, moving slowly, leaning slightly on a cane. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was the same pale gray eyes, the same careful, deliberate way of walking. The woman wore a fine gown now instead of a simple shawl, her silver hair arranged elegantly rather than loose beneath a scarf, but there was no mistaking her face, the same face Eleanor had knelt beside on a muddy road only hours before. The woman's eyes swept across the hall and found Eleanor almost immediately, as though she had been searching for her the entire time. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor felt her heart pounding, uncertain what this meant, uncertain why a woman she had helped on a country road was now standing in the great hall of Ashworth Manor, dressed as though she belonged there completely. The woman's expression did not give anything away. She offered the smallest, most private nod, the kind exchanged between two people who share a secret neither has spoken aloud, and then she turned and moved toward the dais, toward the young Duke, who rose immediately from his seat and crossed the room to meet her, taking her arm with obvious tenderness. "Mother," Eleanor heard him say, his voice carrying just far enough for her to catch it. "I did not expect you to come down this evening." Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her, though she had not moved an inch. The old woman she had helped, the one she had wrapped in a blanket and given tea, the one whose ankle she had bandaged with her own hands, was the Duke's mother. And Eleanor had said nothing of any of it to anyone, not even to herself, fully understanding only now, watching mother and son together at the front of the hall, exactly how much larger the evening had suddenly become. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She had been given a small guest room on the upper floor of the manor, far from the grander chambers reserved for the families with older names and deeper pockets, but it was warm and clean, and under any other circumstances she might have found it perfectly comfortable. Instead, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. The old woman by the fire, the tea, the bandaged ankle, and then, hours later, that same face turning toward her across a crowded hall, dressed in silk, standing beside the Duke as his own mother. She had told the woman everything, her doubts about the gathering, her honest thoughts about the Duke, her lack of ambition to become anyone's wife of convenience. She had spoken as freely as she might have spoken to a stranger she never expected to see again, and now that stranger was the most powerful woman in the house. Eleanor did not know whether to feel embarrassed or afraid. She turned the conversation over in her memory, searching for anything she might have said that could be used against her, and found nothing shameful, only honesty, that should have comforted her. Instead, it left her with a strange, uneasy feeling, as though she had accidentally revealed far more of herself than she intended, to exactly the person who now held the power to judge her. She rose before dawn, unable to bear another hour of restless thought, and dressed quietly in the gray morning light. The manor was mostly silent at this hour, the great hall from the night before now empty and dim, the chandeliers dark, the tables cleared of their earlier abundance. Eleanor wandered down a quiet corridor, drawn by nothing in particular, except a need to move, to think, to escape the four walls of her small room. She found herself in a glass conservatory attached to the eastern side of the house, filled with plants that had somehow survived the cold season, green and living against the pale winter light. She was not the only one there. The Dowager Duchess sat on a stone bench near the center of the room, a shawl around her shoulders, a cup of tea steaming gently in her hands. Her cane rested against the bench beside her, and her ankle, Eleanor noticed, was still wrapped in a fresh bandage beneath her long skirt. "You are an early riser, Lady Hartley," the Duchess said, without turning her head, as though she had heard Eleanor's footsteps the moment she entered. Eleanor froze in the doorway. "Your Grace, I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding. Sit, if you wish, or leave, if that suits you better. I will not command you either way." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and taking a seat on the opposite end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint drip of water from a nearby fountain and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the glass walls. "I did not know," Eleanor said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "On the road, I had no idea who you were." "I know," the Duchess said simply. "That is precisely why it mattered." Eleanor turned to look at her, uncertain what she meant. The Duchess set her teacup down carefully on the stone bench between them and folded her hands in her lap. "Do you know how many young women have passed through this house in the last 3 days, Lady Hartley? How many carriages have rolled up that long drive, each one carrying a daughter dressed to please my son?" "A great many, I imagine." 43, the Duchess said. 43 young women, each one polished and rehearsed, each one taught since childhood exactly how to smile, exactly how to curtsy, exactly which words to say to charm a duke into marriage. And, do you know how many of them, in 3 days, have stopped to notice an old woman struggling on the side of a road? Eleanor said nothing, understanding now where the conversation was leading, and feeling something tighten uncomfortably in her chest. "None," the Duchess said. "Not one. I have walked that road on purpose, more than once these past weeks, dressed plainly, without my title, without my carriage, simply to see who might stop. Carriages pass me daily. Drivers glance and look away. Passengers draw their curtains rather than witness an old woman in distress. You are the first person in all this time who climbed down from a broken carriage, on the very day you had every reason to hurry, and chose instead to kneel in the mud beside a stranger." Eleanor felt her face grow warm. Anyone would have done the same. "That is precisely the lie people tell themselves to avoid feeling the weight of their own choices," the Duchess said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. "Anyone could have done the same. Almost no one does. There is a considerable difference between what a person could do and what a person actually does, Lady Hartley, and it is in that difference that true character lives." Eleanor did not know how to respond to such directness, so she remained silent, watching the steam rise from the abandoned teacup between them. "I did not tell you who I was," the Duchess continued, "because I wanted to see what you would do without the burden of knowing. If you had recognized me on that road, you might have helped out of duty, out of fear of offending someone powerful, out of hope for some advantage later. But you helped a stranger. You helped someone who, as far as you knew, could offer you nothing at all in return." "I still would have helped you," Eleanor said quietly, "even knowing." "I believe you," the Duchess said. "That is exactly why I am telling you this now." Eleanor looked out through the glass walls of the conservatory, toward the gray winter garden beyond, trying to steady her thoughts. "What does this mean, Your Grace? For the gathering? For everything happening in this house?" The Duchess was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. "It means very little officially," she said at last. "I have not spoken to my son of what happened on the road, and I do not intend to, not yet. He must be permitted to form his own judgment of these young women, based on what he sees and hears himself, not on my influence alone. A mother's opinion, however strongly held, should not be the deciding factor in her son's choice of a wife. Then why tell me any of this? The Duchess turned to look at her directly, for the first time since Eleanor had entered the room, her pale gray eyes steady and searching. Because I suspect you are the sort of young woman who worries a great deal about doing the right thing, Lady Hartley, and very little about whether the right thing will be noticed or rewarded. I wanted you to know that, in this house at least, it has been noticed. Whatever happens in the days ahead, know that someone here already sees you clearly. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest, something between gratitude and relief, though she could not have named it precisely. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more to me than I can easily say. The Duchess reached for her cane, preparing to rise, then paused, studying Eleanor once more. A word of caution, if you will permit it. Not every guest in this house shares my patience for honesty. Lady Winslow's family, in particular, has invested a great deal in the outcome of this gathering, and they are not accustomed to losing anything they have decided to want. Watch yourself carefully in the days ahead. Kindness is not always met with kindness in return. I will remember that, Eleanor said. The Duchess rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and paused once more at the edge of the conservatory. One more thing, Lady Hartley. Whatever you decide to think of my son over these coming days, judge him by his actions, and not by his reputation. He has been raised to expect very little honesty from the people around him, which has made him rather good at recognizing it when he finally encounters it. Do not be surprised if he notices you as clearly as I have. With that, she made her slow way out of the conservatory, leaving Eleanor alone among the winter plants, her mind spinning with everything she had just heard. She sat there a long while after the Duchess had gone, watching the gray morning light strengthen slowly beyond the glass, understanding now that the gathering she had entered so reluctantly had already become something far more complicated and far more important than she had ever imagined it could be. By mid-morning, the great hall had transformed itself into something resembling a stage. Rows of gilded chairs had been arranged facing a small raised platform, and household staff moved briskly among them, adjusting cushions, lighting additional candles despite the daylight streaming through the tall windows, preparing the room for what the steward had announced would be the first formal trial of the gathering. Eleanor overheard two servants whispering that the Duke's household held these trials every generation, a tradition meant to test not only a bride's beauty, but her wit, her grace, and her composure under pressure. The first trial, it turned out, was music. Each young woman would perform for the assembled guests, accompanied by the house's small orchestra, and the Duke would listen to every performance before offering his private thoughts to his advisors. Eleanor had learned to play the pianoforte as a child, adequately, but without any particular passion, and she felt her stomach tighten as she watched the other brides prepare with the confidence of women who had trained for exactly this moment since they were old enough to sit upright at a keyboard. Charlotte Winslow performed first, and performed beautifully. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, drawing a complicated, ornamental piece that clearly required years of disciplined training. The audience applauded warmly, and Charlotte rose from the bench with a triumphant smile, glancing once toward Eleanor as though daring her to match such a display. Beatrice performed next, quieter and less showy, but with a gentle sincerity that Eleanor found more affecting than Charlotte's technical brilliance. The Duke listened attentively to each performance, his expression polite but unreadable, offering nothing that revealed his true opinion. When Eleanor's name was called, she rose with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, and took her place at the pianoforte. She had chosen a simple piece, one her mother had taught her years ago, quiet and unadorned, without the flourishes the other women had used to impress the room. She played it exactly as she had always played it, without pretense, letting the simple melody speak for itself. When she finished, there was a brief silence before the applause came, polite but not enthusiastic, and Eleanor felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks as she returned to her seat, aware of Charlotte's barely concealed satisfaction nearby. The second trial, held that afternoon, was conversation. Each bride was seated at a long table, alongside several of the Duke's advisors and family friends, expected to demonstrate wit, intelligence, and grace under the scrutiny of experienced observers. Eleanor found this trial somewhat easier, since it required honesty rather than performance, and she answered each question put to her thoughtfully, without exaggeration, Without the calculated cleverness she noticed some of the other women straining to produce. At one point, an elderly advisor asked her opinion on the responsibilities of a noble household toward the villages under its protection, a question clearly meant to test political awareness rather than charm. Several of the other women had given vague, flattering answers designed to please rather than inform. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. A household's wealth means little, she said, if the people living under its protection are left hungry or afraid. I believe a noble family's true measure is not how grandly it lives, but how well it cares for those who have no power to demand better treatment. The table grew quiet for a moment. Eleanor worried immediately that she had spoken too plainly, too critically, for an audience gathered specifically to celebrate the wealth and grandeur of the household in question. But when she glanced toward the head of the table, she found the Duke watching her with the same flicker of genuine interest she had noticed the previous evening, his advisors murmuring quietly among themselves. Charlotte, seated across the table, offered a tight smile. A noble sentiment, she said. Though rather easier to express than to practice, I imagine. Perhaps, Eleanor replied evenly, but I would rather express it and attempt to practice it imperfectly than never express it at all. The conversation moved on, but Eleanor noticed the Duke's gaze lingering on her a moment longer than seemed strictly necessary, and she felt a small, unfamiliar warmth beneath her nervousness, something she did not yet have a name for. That evening, after the day's trials had concluded, Eleanor found herself walking alone through the manor's quiet library, drawn by the smell of old paper and leather bindings, grateful for a moment away from the constant scrutiny of the gathering. She had not expected to encounter anyone else there, and she startled slightly when a voice spoke from a shadowed corner near the tall windows. You have a gift for making advisors uncomfortable, Lady Hartley. Eleanor turned to find the Duke himself standing near a shelf of leather-bound volumes, a book open in his hands, his expression carrying the faint suggestion of amusement rather than displeasure. I did not mean to cause discomfort, Your Grace. I did not say it was unwelcome discomfort, he replied, closing the book and setting it carefully back on the shelf. My advisors have grown rather too accustomed to flattering answers. It does them good, occasionally, to hear something honest, even if it unsettles them. Eleanor did not know how to respond to that, so she remained silent, watching him cross the room slowly, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. May I ask you something directly, Lady Hartley? Of course. Do you wish to be chosen? The question caught her off guard with its bluntness, and she considered it carefully before answering, sensing that anything less than complete honesty would be immediately recognized for what it was. I do not know you well enough yet to answer that honestly, Your Grace, she said finally. I did not arrive here dreaming of becoming a duchess. I arrived because my family expected it of me. Whatever happens beyond that, I have not yet decided how I feel about it. Something in his expression shifted, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived at the manor, she saw something like genuine surprise cross his features. Most young women in this house would have answered that question very differently. I imagine they would have. And yet you did not. I did not think a lie would serve either of us particularly well, Your Grace. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. My mother mentioned you to me this morning, he said eventually, only in passing. She did not explain her reasons, but she suggested I pay particular attention to your presence in this gathering. Eleanor's heart quickened, uncertain how much the Duchess had revealed. Did she say why, Your Grace? No, he said. She rarely explains her reasons for anything. She prefers to let people reveal themselves, in time, without her interference. He paused, watching Eleanor carefully. I confess I am curious what she saw in you that made her think it worth mentioning at all. Eleanor felt a flicker of relief that the Duchess had kept their encounter private, though she also felt a growing unease at carrying a secret she had not chosen to keep. Perhaps she simply noticed that I arrived covered in mud, Eleanor said lightly, hoping to deflect the moment with humor. The Duke's mouth curved into something almost like a real smile. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect there is more to it than that. He did not press the matter further, and Eleanor did not offer any further explanation, though she left the library that evening with the distinct sense that the quiet, careful game the Dowager Duchess had begun on a muddy country road was far from finished, and that she herself had become, without quite intending it, one of its most important players. The Dowager Duchess did not attend breakfast the following morning, nor did she appear at the small gathering of brides assembled in the drawing room to discuss the day's planned activities. Instead, she remained in her private chambers, watching quietly through a narrow window as carriages and household staff moved about the grounds below, thinking carefully about what she had set in motion. She had not lied to Eleanor about her reasons for staying silent regarding their encounter on the road. A mother's influence, spoken too loudly or too often, could easily overwhelm a son's own judgment, and the Duchess had spent years teaching her son to trust his own eyes, rather than the opinions offered to him by others. But privacy was not the same as inaction, and the Duchess had never been a woman content simply to watch events unfold without occasionally nudging them in a useful direction. She rang a small bell on her writing desk, and within moments, her most trusted attendant, a quiet woman named Margaret who had served the household for over 20 years, appeared at the door. "Your Grace?" "Margaret, I have a small task for you, one that requires a certain amount of discretion." "Of course, Your Grace." The Duchess folded her hands in her lap, considering her words carefully. "Tomorrow, during the household staff's midday meal, I would like you to arrange a small accident. Nothing dangerous, you understand. A dropped tray, perhaps, in full view of the young women gathered for their afternoon activities. I want to see how each of them responds when a servant appears to be in distress, without any of them suspecting they are being observed for exactly that purpose." Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though a flicker of understanding passed behind her eyes. "You wish to test their character, Your Grace, rather than their manners." "Precisely," the Duchess said. "Anyone can learn to curtsy gracefully, or answer a question cleverly, with enough practice and enough motivation. But how a person treats someone who can offer them nothing in return, someone with no power to reward or punish them, that is far more difficult to fake convincingly. I have watched enough performances these past days to grow rather tired of practiced smiles. And who shall play the part of the distressed servant, Your Grace?" The Duchess considered this for a moment. "Old Agnes, I think. She has served this household for nearly 30 years, and she has a gift for appearing genuinely distraught, even when nothing is truly wrong. Explain to her exactly what is needed, and ensure she understands this is simply a small performance, nothing more." Margaret nodded, and moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back toward the Duchess with quiet curiosity. "May I ask, Your Grace, whether this test is meant for one particular young woman, or all of them equally?" The Duchess allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "All of them, Margaret, though I confess I already have a fairly strong suspicion how at least one of them will respond." Margaret departed to arrange the details, and the Duchess turned back toward her window, watching the gray winter light fall across the manor's gardens, thinking of a muddy road and a young woman who had knelt without hesitation beside a stranger she had every reason to ignore. The following afternoon arrived cold and overcast, and the assembled brides gathered in the manor's long gallery for what had been announced as a leisurely afternoon of refreshments and quiet conversation, a deliberate contrast to the more demanding trials of the previous days. Trays of tea and delicate pastries were carried among the guests by household staff, and the atmosphere in the gallery was noticeably more relaxed than it had been during the earlier formal trials. It was into this relaxed atmosphere that old Agnes appeared, carrying a heavily laden tray toward the center of the gallery, her steps slower and more hesitant than usual. As she reached a point directly in front of the largest cluster of noble daughters, her foot seemed to catch against the edge of a carpet, and the tray tipped forward with a tremendous clatter, sending cups, saucers, and pastries scattering across the polished floor. Agnes let out a small cry of distress, sinking to her knees among the wreckage, her hands trembling as she attempted to gather the broken pieces. Charlotte Winslow, standing nearest the accident, stepped back sharply, lifting the hem of her gown away from a small puddle of spilled tea, with an expression of open irritation. "Honestly," she muttered, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, "one would think the household could afford servants capable of carrying a simple tray without disaster." Another young woman laughed softly at the comment, while a third simply turned away entirely, resuming her conversation as though nothing at all had happened. A fourth offered a brief, dismissive glance toward Agnes, before calling for another servant to come and clean up the mess, her tone carrying more impatience than concern. Eleanor, seated near the edge of the gallery in quiet conversation with Beatrice, was on her feet, and moving before she had fully registered the decision to move at all. She knelt immediately beside Agnes, ignoring the tea soaking into the hem of her own gown, and began gathering the broken pieces of china with careful hands, taking care to avoid the sharp edges. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, her voice low enough that only Agnes and those nearest could hear. "No, my lady. Only startled," Agnes murmured, her eyes flicking briefly toward Eleanor, with an expression that seemed almost too knowing for a woman meant to be embarrassed and flustered. "Let me help you up," Eleanor said, offering her arm. "There is no need to hurry. These things can be gathered in a moment." She helped Agnes rise slowly to her feet, steadying her when she seemed to sway slightly, and then knelt again to finish collecting the scattered china, while Agnes composed herself. Beatrice joined her a moment later, kneeling to help as well, though with noticeably less confidence than Eleanor, glancing nervously toward the other guests, as though worried about the impression she might be creating. "There," Eleanor said finally, setting the last broken piece onto the tray and rising to her feet. "I am sure it looked far worse than it truly was. Please do not trouble yourself over it further." Agnes offered a quiet, genuine smile, one that seemed to carry more warmth than the situation strictly required, before gathering the tray and making her slow way out of the gallery. Charlotte, watching the entire scene unfold with poorly concealed disdain, turned toward the small cluster of women near her with a quiet, cutting remark. "How touching," she said. "Some people simply cannot resist making a spectacle of their own kindness." "I did not realize helping someone required an audience to be genuine," Eleanor replied evenly, having overheard the comment clearly. Charlotte's expression tightened, but before she could offer any response, the gallery's tall doors opened, and the Duke himself entered the room, accompanied by two of his advisors, apparently drawn by the earlier commotion. His eyes moved briefly across the scattered remnants of the accident, then settled on Eleanor, still standing near the spot where she had knelt to help, her gown stained with tea. He said nothing at the time, offering only a brief, polite acknowledgement to the assembled guests, before continuing on his way with his advisors. But Eleanor noticed, just before he turned away, the same flicker of quiet interest she had seen in his eyes twice before, and she wondered, not for the first time, exactly how much of what happened in this house was truly as accidental as it appeared. Unknown to Eleanor, in a small antechamber overlooking the gallery, the Dowager Duchess had watched the entire scene unfold through a narrow gap in a curtain, her expression carrying a quiet, satisfied certainty that confirmed everything she had already suspected on a cold and muddy road several days before. Word of the incident in the gallery spread through the manor's household staff by nightfall, carried from kitchen to corridor, in the particular way that servants' gossip always found its way eventually to noble ears. By the following morning, several of the other brides had grown noticeably cooler toward Eleanor, their earlier polite indifference replaced by something sharper and more deliberate. Charlotte Winslow, in particular, seemed determined to ensure that Eleanor's small act of kindness would not go unpunished. Eleanor first noticed the shift during the midday meal, when she found her usual seat near Beatrice already occupied, forcing her to take a place at the far end of the table among women who offered her only the barest civility. She noticed it again that afternoon, when a planned walk through the manor's gardens somehow proceeded without anyone informing her of the gathering time, leaving her to discover, upon arriving late, that the group had already departed without her. She said nothing of these small slights to anyone, understanding instinctively that complaining would only make her appear weak or overly sensitive, qualities she suspected Charlotte would be delighted to see attributed to her. Instead, she continued moving through the gathering with quiet composure, attending each scheduled activity, answering each question honestly, refusing to let the coldness of her fellow guests alter her behavior in any way. It was Beatrice, surprising Eleanor with unexpected courage, who first mentioned the source of the trouble directly. "Charlotte has been telling people you only helped that servant to make yourself appear favorably in front of the Duke," Beatrice said quietly, finding Eleanor alone in the manor's small chapel one evening, where Eleanor had retreated for a moment of peace away from the gathering. "She says your kindness is a performance, calculated rather than genuine." Eleanor absorbed this without visible reaction, though something tightened uncomfortably in her chest. "And do you believe that, Beatrice?" "No," Beatrice said simply. "I was there. I saw your face when you knelt beside her. No one performs an expression like that. I have watched Charlotte perform kindness for years. ever since we were children together, and it never once looked like what I saw from you yesterday." "Thank you for saying so." Beatrice hesitated, twisting her hands together nervously. "I only wanted you to know why the others have grown so cold toward you these past 2 days. It seemed unfair that you should wonder without understanding the reason." Eleanor considered this information carefully over the following hours, understanding now the source of the small cruelties she had endured, though she found she could not summon much anger toward Charlotte, only a quiet, tired sadness at the lengths some people would go to protect an advantage they feared losing. That evening, the gathering assembled once more in the great hall for a formal dinner, the third such occasion since the trials had begun, and Eleanor took her seat quietly among the other guests, bracing herself for another evening of careful navigation through unfriendly company. The Duke, seated at the head of the long table, rose partway through the meal to address the assembled guests, thanking them for their patience through the various trials, and announcing that the following day would bring the gathering's final formal event, after which he would retire briefly to consider his decision before announcing his choice. As the meal continued, Eleanor noticed Charlotte watching her from across the table with an expression of calculated confidence, as though satisfied that whatever damage her whispered accusations had caused would be sufficient to secure her own position ahead of Eleanor's. It was near the meal's conclusion, as servants began clearing the final course, that Charlotte finally spoke directly, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to those seated nearby. "I do wonder, Lady Hartley," she said, her tone deceptively pleasant, "whether your little display in the gallery yesterday was truly as spontaneous as it appeared, or whether you had perhaps anticipated an audience worth impressing." Several conversations nearby fell quiet, guests turning with poorly concealed interest toward the exchange. Eleanor felt her face grow warm, though she forced herself to remain calm, understanding that any visible anger would only confirm whatever narrative Charlotte was attempting to construct. "I did not know the Duke would enter the gallery at that moment," Eleanor said evenly. "I helped Agnes because she was distressed, not because I expected anyone of importance to witness it." "How convenient, then, that someone of importance did witness it," Charlotte replied, a thin smile playing at her lips. "I do not think kindness becomes less genuine simply because it happens to be observed, Lady Winslow," Eleanor said. "By that reasoning, no act of goodness performed in public could ever be trusted, which seems a rather sad way to view the world." A quiet murmur passed among the nearby guests, and Eleanor noticed several expressions shift subtly, some toward reluctant approval of her response. Charlotte's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, opening her mouth to offer some further remark. Before she could speak, however, a quiet voice interrupted from further down the table, cutting through the tension with unexpected authority. "Perhaps," the Dowager Duchess said, having entered the hall unnoticed during the exchange, and now standing near the head of the table beside her son, "we might allow Lady Hartley the same benefit of the doubt we would extend to anyone else in this room, rather than assuming the worst of her character, simply because her kindness happened to occur in view of others." The hall fell into complete silence. Charlotte's face paled visibly, and she offered a hasty, stammering apology, insisting she had meant nothing serious by her remarks. The Duchess accepted this apology with cool, polite grace, though her eyes lingered on Charlotte a moment longer than seemed entirely comfortable, before she moved to take her own seat beside her son. Eleanor caught the Duchess's eye briefly across the table, and though neither of them spoke, she understood immediately that the older woman's intervention had been deliberate, a quiet correction, offered not out of favoritism, but out of a simple refusal to watch honesty be punished in her own household. The remainder of the dinner passed more quietly. The earlier tension dissolved, though not entirely forgotten, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since arriving at the manor, feeling less like an unwelcome outsider, and more like someone whose presence in this strange, glittering competition might actually matter. The final formal event of the gathering was announced the next morning, as a day spent touring the estate's surrounding villages, a tradition, the steward explained, that allowed each young woman the opportunity to observe firsthand the people and lands she might one day help oversee as Duchess. Carriages were arranged to carry small groups of guests through the countryside, stopping at various points along the way where tenants and villagers had gathered, curious to catch a glimpse of the women being considered for their future Duchess. Eleanor found herself seated in a carriage alongside Beatrice and two other young women, both of whom had grown somewhat friendlier toward her since the incident at dinner, apparently reconsidering their earlier alliance with Charlotte's version of events. The carriage rolled slowly along country roads Eleanor recognized from her own journey days before, past the very bend where she had first knelt to help a stranger she had not known was the Duke's own mother. Their first stop was a small village, where the local families had gathered near the central well, offering polite curtsies and murmured greetings as the noble visitors stepped down from their carriages. Eleanor moved among the villagers with genuine warmth, asking after their harvests, their children, their small concerns, listening attentively to answers the other brides seemed to receive with polite but distracted nods, before moving quickly on to the next obligation. At one cottage near the edge of the village, an elderly farmer approached hesitantly, explaining through an anxious stammer that his roof had been damaged in a recent storm, and that he worried the coming winter would prove difficult without proper repairs. Several of the other visiting brides offered sympathetic murmurs before continuing on their way, clearly uncertain how to respond to a problem so far removed from their own experience. Eleanor stopped, however, and asked the farmer detailed questions about the extent of the damage, the materials needed for repair, and whether he had already sought assistance from the estate's steward. When he admitted, embarrassed, that he had been reluctant to trouble the household with such a small concern during such an important gathering, Eleanor found the steward accompanying their party and quietly ensured the farmer's situation was noted for immediate attention. She did not realize, as she performed this small act of practical kindness, that the Duke himself had arrived at the same village only moments earlier, having chosen to travel separately from the main procession in order to observe the villages without the formal ceremony typically surrounding his visits. He watched from a short distance as Eleanor knelt beside the elderly farmer's damaged doorway, listening carefully to his concerns, arranging for practical help, rather than offering only sympathetic words. He approached slowly once the conversation concluded, and Eleanor startled slightly upon noticing him standing nearby. "Your Grace, I did not know you had arrived. I preferred to observe today's visits quietly, rather than have my presence alter how the villagers behaved," he said, "though I confess, I did not expect to observe quite what I just witnessed. It was only a small matter, Your Grace. The roof needed attention before winter. A small matter to you, perhaps," he said, "though I suspect it did not feel small to that farmer, who has likely worried over that roof for weeks, uncertain whether anyone of importance would ever take his concerns seriously enough to act on it." Eleanor did not know how to respond to this, so she remained quiet, watching him carefully. "May I walk with you a while, Lady Hartley?" he asked. "There is a path along the river, just beyond this village, that I have always found peaceful, and I find I have grown rather tired of formal ceremony these past days." Eleanor agreed, and they walked together along the quiet riverside path, their conversation unhurried and unguarded in a way that surprised them both. The Duke asked her about her family, her home, her thoughts on the estate and its people, and Eleanor answered honestly, without the careful calculation she suspected many of the other brides employed in his presence. "You are unlike most of the young women who came to this gathering," he said eventually, as they paused near a small stone bridge crossing the river. "I have been told that before, Your Grace, though I am never certain whether it is meant as a compliment." "It is meant as one," he said. "I have spent these past several days listening to carefully rehearsed answers and watching carefully rehearsed smiles, until I began to wonder whether any of it meant anything at all beyond ambition. And then I watched you kneel beside a farmer's damaged doorway, offering practical help rather than empty sympathy, exactly as you knelt beside a servant in the gallery a few days before, without any apparent concern for how it might appear." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the direct comparison, uncertain how much he had truly understood about her character in such a short time. "May I ask you something honestly, Lady Hartley?" he continued. "Why did you agree to come to this gathering at all, if you truly held no ambition to become anyone's wife of convenience?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "My family asked it of me, Your Grace, and I did not wish to disappoint them. But if I am being entirely honest, I also found myself curious. I had heard so many conflicting things about you before arriving here, some flattering, some far less so, and I wanted to see for myself which version, if either, held any truth. And what have you concluded?" "I have concluded that reputation rarely tells the whole truth about anyone," she said. "You are more thoughtful than I expected, and considerably less arrogant than the rumors suggested, though I suspect you already knew that." He laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even himself. That is perhaps the most honest assessment anyone has offered me in years, Lady Hartley. They continued walking a while longer before returning to rejoin the formal procession, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both understood that something had shifted between them during that quiet walk along the river, something neither the polished performances of the earlier trials nor the careful whispers of jealous rivals had managed to create. As their carriages finally turned back toward the manor that evening, Eleanor found herself watching the darkening countryside pass by the window, thinking not of duchesses or grand titles, but simply of an honest conversation beside a quiet river, and wondering, for the first time since her arrival, whether she might actually want to be chosen after all. That night, after the household had settled into quiet and the manor's many candles had been extinguished one by one, the Duke found himself unable to sleep, his thoughts returning again and again to the conversation beside the river. He rose from his bed and made his way to his mother's private sitting room, where a thin line of candlelight beneath the door suggested she too remained awake. The Dowager Duchess looked up from her needlework as her son entered, unsurprised by the late visit, as though she had been expecting it for some time. "You wished to speak with me," she said, setting her work aside and gesturing toward the chair opposite her own. "How did you know?" A mother knows when her son's mind is unsettled, even before he knows it himself. She studied him carefully as he sat, noting the faint furrow of his brow, the restless way his hands moved in his lap. "Is this about Lady Hartley?" He looked up sharply. "You knew I would ask about her." "I suspected you might, eventually," the Duchess said. "Though I confess, I did not expect it to happen quite this quickly." "Mother," he said, leaning forward slightly, "there is something about her that I cannot quite explain, something different from every other guest in this house. She speaks honestly, even when honesty seems likely to cost her something. She helps people who can offer her nothing in return, without any apparent thought of being noticed for it. And yet Charlotte Winslow has been telling anyone who will listen that her kindness is merely a performance calculated to win favor. And what do you believe?" "I believe Charlotte is wrong," he said firmly, "but I find myself wondering why I believe it so strongly, on so little actual evidence." The Duchess considered her son for a long moment, weighing carefully whether the time had finally come to share what she had kept private for days. She had told herself she would wait until his own judgment had fully formed, uninfluenced by her own opinion. And watching him now, troubled and thoughtful in equal measure, she sensed that moment had finally arrived. "There is something I have not yet told you," she said slowly. "Something that happened before Lady Hartley ever arrived at this gathering." She told him then, carefully and completely, of the broken carriage wheel on the country road, of the old woman struggling with a fallen basket whom nearly every other passing carriage had chosen to ignore, of the young woman who had climbed down without hesitation, gathered scattered apples from the mud, and helped a stranger home, despite having every reason to hurry onward toward an important gathering. She told him of the tea shared by the fire, the bandaged ankle, the honest conversation about a gathering Eleanor had not particularly wanted to attend, spoken freely to a woman she believed to be nothing more than an ordinary elderly stranger. The Duke listened in complete silence, his expression shifting slowly from surprise to something deeper and more complicated as his mother's story unfolded. "You were the old woman," he said finally, understanding settling over him. "Eleanor helped you, on the road, before she ever knew who you truly were." "She did," the Duchess confirmed, "and she has not spoken a single word of it since, to anyone. Not even to gain some small advantage for herself in this gathering, though she certainly could have used it to considerable effect against her rivals. She has simply continued behaving exactly as she behaved on that road, kind and honest, regardless of who might be watching, or what advantage it might bring her." The Duke sat back in his chair, absorbing this information slowly. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted you to reach your own conclusions about her character, formed from your own observations rather than shaped by mine," the Duchess said. "A mother's influence, however well-intentioned, should never replace a son's own judgment in matters as important as choosing a partner for life. I have watched you these past days, and I have watched Lady Hartley, and I believe you have already begun to see in her exactly what I saw on that road." "I have," he admitted quietly, "though I confess, I did not fully understand why, until this moment." "There is something else you should consider," the Duchess added, her expression growing more serious. Charlotte Winslow's accusations against Lady Hartley, whispered so freely throughout this gathering, reveal rather more about Charlotte's own character than they do about Eleanor's. A person confident in their own worth rarely feels the need to diminish someone else's. I have watched Charlotte's ambition closely these past days, and I confess it concerns me a great deal, considerably more than anything I have observed in Lady Hartley. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning his mother's words over carefully in his mind. "Tomorrow, I must announce my decision," he said finally. "The gathering concludes, and every family here expects an answer." "Then perhaps," the Duchess said gently, "you already know what that answer should be, and have simply been waiting for the courage to trust it." He looked at his mother for a long moment, something resolving behind his eyes, before rising slowly from his chair. "Thank you, Mother, for telling me, and for waiting until I was ready to hear it." "I only hope I have not waited too long," she said, watching him move toward the door. "Kindness, as genuine as hers, deserves to be recognized before it is worn down by jealousy and suspicion. Do not let tomorrow pass without making certain she understands exactly how clearly she has been seen." The Duke paused at the door, glancing back at his mother with an expression of quiet determination that reminded her, not for the first time, of the boy he had once been before the weight of his title had settled so heavily upon his shoulders. "I do not intend to, Mother," he said. "Not this time." He left her sitting room and returned to his own chambers, though sleep remained elusive for the remainder of the night, his mind turning over everything his mother had revealed, and everything he himself had already begun to understand about the quiet, honest young woman who had arrived at his gathering covered in mud, and had somehow, without any apparent effort at all, become the one guest whose absence from the final announcement he could no longer imagine. Charlotte Winslow did not sleep well either that night, though her restlessness stemmed from an entirely different source than the Duke's. She had watched, with growing alarm over the preceding days, the quiet shift in the Duke's attention toward Eleanor Hartley, a shift she had initially dismissed as a passing curiosity, but now recognized, with mounting anxiety, as something far more serious. Her family had invested considerable resources into securing this match, resources her father had made clear could not be recovered if the gathering ended in failure. She could not, she told herself, allow a plain, unremarkable young woman from a minor family to undo weeks of careful preparation through nothing more than a few small acts of kindness toward servants and villagers. She rose before dawn and made her way to the manor's kitchens, where she found a young kitchen maid she had befriended earlier in the week through small gifts and flattering attention. Precisely the sort of quiet investment Charlotte had learned long ago could prove useful when circumstances required it. "I need a favor," Charlotte said quietly, drawing the maid aside into a shadowed corner of the kitchen corridor. "Nothing difficult. I only need you to mention something to one of the other guests, something you overheard, quite by accident, concerning Lady Hartley." The maid hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. "What would you have me say, my lady?" "Only that you overheard Lady Hartley speaking privately with a servant, suggesting that her kindness these past days has all been calculated, a deliberate strategy discussed openly among the staff, designed specifically to win the Duke's favor through false displays of compassion for people she does not actually care about at all." "But that is not true, my lady. I have seen Lady Hartley myself. She has always been kind to us, and never once has she suggested any of what you describe." Charlotte's expression hardened slightly. "It does not need to be true, only believed. Do this for me, and I will ensure your position in this household remains secure long after this gathering concludes, regardless of who eventually becomes Duchess." The maid, torn between her genuine fondness for Eleanor and her fear of displeasing a powerful noble guest, reluctantly agreed, though her discomfort remained evident in her downcast eyes, as Charlotte departed the kitchen satisfied with her morning's work. What Charlotte did not know, however, was that old Agnes had been standing quietly in the adjoining pantry throughout the entire conversation, having arrived early to prepare the morning's bread, and had overheard every word exchanged between Charlotte and the young maid with growing outrage. Agnes wasted no time. Within the hour, she had made her way to Margaret, the Duchess's trusted attendant, and relayed everything she had witnessed with careful, precise detail. Margaret listened gravely before making her own way immediately to the Duchess's private chambers. The Duchess received the news with quiet, controlled anger, though she said little beyond thanking Margaret for the information and requesting that Agnes be brought to her directly. "You are certain of what you heard?" the Duchess asked, once Agnes stood before her, still slightly out of breath from hurrying through the manor's corridors. "Certain, Your Grace. Every word, exactly as I have told Margaret. Lady Winslow meant to spread a false rumor about Lady Hartley through young Sally, meaning to poison the gathering's opinion of her before your son makes his final decision." The Duchess was quiet for a long moment, her expression carefully composed despite the anger simmering beneath it. She had suspected Charlotte capable of jealousy and unkindness, having witnessed enough small cruelties throughout the gathering to form a reasonably clear picture of her character. But deliberate manipulation of household staff, coercing an innocent young maid into spreading falsehoods through fear of losing her position, revealed something considerably darker than simple jealousy. "Thank you, Agnes," the Duchess said finally. "You have done a great service to this household by bringing this to my attention so quickly. Please assure Sally that her position here is entirely secure, regardless of anything Lady Winslow may have suggested, and that she need not follow through with any part of this scheme." Agnes curtsied gratefully and departed, leaving the Duchess alone with her thoughts, considering carefully how best to handle what she had learned. She could confront Charlotte directly, though she suspected such an accusation would only be denied outright, reduced to nothing more than one servant's word against a noble guest's. She could simply wait, allowing the scheme to unfold, and trusting that the falsehood would eventually reveal itself as such. But something in her, some protective instinct she had not expected to feel so strongly toward a young woman she had known for barely a week, urged her toward more direct action. She decided, finally, that the truth would serve its own purpose best, if allowed to surface naturally, in front of the entire gathering, at the very moment such a revelation would carry the greatest weight. She sent word to her son requesting a brief private conversation before the day's final events began, and when he arrived, troubled by the summons, she explained everything Agnes had witnessed with calm, deliberate precision. The Duke's expression darkened considerably as he listened, his earlier admiration for Eleanor, now joined by a rising anger toward the woman, who had apparently spent days attempting to undermine her through calculated cruelty. "What would you have me do, Mother?" "Nothing rash," the Duchess said carefully. "Allow the day to unfold as planned. I suspect Lady Winslow's scheme will reveal itself in time, particularly once Sally realizes she need not carry through with a falsehood she clearly finds distasteful. Sometimes the most effective response to dishonesty is simply to ensure the truth is given every opportunity to be heard, without forcing the matter prematurely." The Duke nodded slowly, though something resolute had settled behind his eyes, a quiet determination that suggested he had already begun forming his own plans for how the day's final gathering might unfold. Plans that would leave no doubt whatsoever, once the truth was finally revealed, exactly where his own judgment and affection had settled. By evening, the great hall had filled once more with every guest the gathering had drawn to Ashworth Manor. Candles blazing overhead, the assembled families arranged in careful rows to witness the moment they had all been waiting weeks to see. Eleanor sat quietly among the other brides, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain what to expect from the evening ahead, though she had noticed throughout the day a strange undercurrent of tension moving through the household staff, quiet whispers exchanged in corners that fell silent whenever a noble guest approached. She had not heard, and would not learn until later, of Sally's tearful confession to Margaret that morning, admitting everything Charlotte had asked of her, and expressing her deep relief at being released from the burden of spreading a lie she had never wanted to tell. Nor had she heard of the quiet fury that had settled over the Duke throughout the day, carefully hidden beneath his composed exterior, as he greeted guests and fulfilled his final obligations before the evening's announcement. The steward called the hall to order, and a hush fell over the assembled guests as the Duke rose from his seat at the head of the room, his mother seated beside him, her expression calm and watchful. "I wish to thank every family gathered here," he began, "for the honor of considering your daughters as potential companions for my life and this household. I have spent these past days observing not only grace and wit, qualities I expected to find in abundance among such distinguished company, but something considerably rarer and more valuable, character revealed not through performance, but through action." He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled brides before settling, briefly, on Charlotte Winslow, whose confident smile faltered slightly under his steady attention. "Before I announce my decision," he continued, "I wish to share a story that I believe illustrates precisely the qualities I have come to value most highly during this gathering." He glanced toward his mother, who nodded once, granting silent permission for what he was about to reveal. "Several days before this gathering formally began," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "my mother chose to walk a country road alone, dressed plainly, without carriage or escort, curious to observe how ordinary travelers might treat an elderly stranger in apparent distress. She fell, injuring her ankle, and struggled to gather a basket of scattered goods along that roadside for some time before any assistance arrived. A murmur of surprise moved through the hall, guests exchanging uncertain glances, clearly wondering where this unexpected story might be leading. Several carriages passed her that day," the Duke continued, "carrying guests traveling toward this very gathering, each one hurrying toward an important occasion, each one choosing to look away rather than delay their journey for a stranger's misfortune. Only one carriage stopped. Only one young woman climbed down into the mud, gathered scattered apples with her own hands, and helped an elderly stranger safely home, sharing tea and honest conversation, without ever suspecting the true identity of the woman she had chosen to help." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as understanding settled over her, her eyes moving instinctively toward the Dowager Duchess, who returned her gaze with a small, warm smile. "That young woman," the Duke said, his voice steady and clear, "arrived at this gathering hours late, her gown covered in mud, her hair undone by wind and travel, having sacrificed her own punctuality and appearance for the sake of a stranger who could offer her nothing in return. She has spent every day since behaving with exactly that same quiet integrity, kneeling to help a servant when others turned away in irritation, arranging practical assistance for a struggling farmer while others offered only empty sympathy, and enduring, I have recently learned, a deliberate and calculated attempt by another guest to poison this household's opinion of her through falsehoods spread among innocent staff too frightened to refuse." Charlotte's face had gone entirely pale, her earlier confidence collapsing into visible panic as every eye in the hall turned toward her with dawning understanding. "I will not name the guest responsible for that particular scheme," the Duke continued, his gaze resting briefly and pointedly on Charlotte regardless, "as I believe the truth of her character has already revealed itself clearly enough this evening, without further comment from me. I mention it only to illustrate the considerable difference between kindness performed for an audience and kindness practiced consistently, quietly, and honestly, regardless of who might be watching or what advantage it might bring." He turned then, fully, toward Eleanor, who rose slowly from her seat as every guest in the hall watched, understanding now exactly where this remarkable evening had been leading all along. "Lady Eleanor Hartley," the Duke said, crossing the room to stand before her, "I have spent these past days searching, without fully realizing it at first, for exactly the qualities you have shown so consistently since the moment you arrived at this gathering, covered in mud and utterly unconcerned with impressing anyone at all. You helped my mother without knowing who she was. You helped a servant without any thought of reward. You helped a struggling farmer without any expectation of recognition. And through all of it, you have remained honest, even when honesty seemed likely to cost you dearly." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment and the unexpected tenderness in his voice. "I do not offer you this choice because of your family's name, or your fortune, or your skill at any of the trials arranged for this gathering," he said. "I offer it because I have come to believe, with complete certainty, that you possess exactly the character I would wish to see guiding this household and its people for the rest of my life. Lady Eleanor Hartley, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The hall remained utterly silent, every guest holding their breath, waiting for her answer. Eleanor looked past him, briefly, toward the Dowager Duchess, who offered a small, encouraging nod, and then back toward the Duke himself, whose dark eyes held none of the polite boredom she had first noticed upon her arrival, replaced now by something warm and hopeful and entirely genuine. "Yes," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, Your Grace, I will." The hall erupted into applause, genuine and warm from most of the assembled guests, though Charlotte Winslow slipped quietly toward the door. Her earlier ambitions collapsed entirely beneath the weight of her own exposed dishonesty. The Duke took Eleanor's hands in his own, his smile wide and unguarded in a way none of the household staff could recall ever having witnessed before, and led her forward to stand beside him before the assembled crowd. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had finally quieted and the guests had begun retiring to their chambers, Eleanor found the Dowager Duchess waiting for her in the same quiet conservatory where they had first spoken honestly of the road, the fallen basket, and the small kindness that had somehow, without either of them fully understanding how, changed the course of everything that followed. "I did not expect any of this," Eleanor admitted, settling onto the familiar stone bench beside the older woman. "When I stopped that day, I only wanted to help someone who needed it. I never imagined it would lead here." "That," the Duchess said, taking Eleanor's hand warmly in her own, "is precisely why it did. The truest kindness, my dear, is never performed in hope of reward. It is simply who a person chooses to be, on ordinary days, on muddy roads, when no one important is watching at all. You will make a fine Duchess, Eleanor Hartley, not because you competed well in this gathering's trials, but because you never once needed to compete at all." Outside the conservatory's glass walls, the winter garden lay quiet beneath a sky slowly clearing of clouds, and Eleanor sat for a long while in comfortable silence beside the woman she had once helped, without knowing her name, understanding now, fully and completely, that the greatest reward of kindness had never been the recognition it might bring, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge of having done what was right, regardless of who was watching, and regardless of what she stood to gain.